Leadership with New Horizons. My name is Marc Barber, Director of Content at Criticaleye, and I'll be in conversation today with Matthew Blagg, Criticaleye's CEO. Hello, Matthew.
Morning, Mark. Hope you're well.
I'm very well, thank you. You?
Extremely well in the office, and it's a nice sunny day out there,
Yes.
I think.
Well, it's not here in Wiltshire, but there we go. Okay, so today we're going to be looking at what's front of mind for CEOs, based around our recent CEO retreat that we held, where we explored themes such as board dynamics, customer focus, agility, and purpose, which was the underlying theme tying together a lot of the different sessions. At the start of our retreats, we ask the attendees to conduct a word cloud where we ask them to put one word in that responded to the question that we asked them, which was use one word to describe 2021 so far. It's been good we've asked this quite a lot over the past sort of 8 or 9 months, and it's gone from frustrating and challenging to we were very happy to see that the dominant word was optimistic. However, beneath that, you did have people feeling frustrated and uncertain. And I think you would expect that to some degree. We are seeing a shift. There is more positivity. Did that sort of resonate with your thoughts and feelings, Matthew?
Yes, I think so. I think that there is a more positive position than there was 6 months ago, certainly 12 months ago. I think though that if you'd said to me what was my one word that I'd have used contradictory. And why? Because I think that for every positive case, there's still a negative case. And I think that by their very nature, CEOs are forward-looking. So to a certain extent, they should be of the optimistic end of the spectrum. But I think that within that you have this incredibly complex, contradictory world that we're in, with massively varying degrees of that contradiction. Just on a call with someone in Singapore, and obviously this week they've just gone back into a lockdown, and again that highlights the fact that even some of the countries that have had what would be termed a positive COVID experience are still in a state of sort of challenge, and this element of degrees of travel, what are the implications of that, and regulatory elements are in that similar case. And so I think that overall, I think those words reflect the positive elements, but if you look across the whole spectrum, there is these contradictory elements, and I think that's true from an individual perspective and from a company and societal perspective.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's multi-speed, isn't it? I mean, it's say where we are in the UK at the moment, yes, there is a degree of optimism at the moment. That would have been very different to January, but then clearly you've got horrific scenes in India at the moment, and that came across, didn't it, during the retreat, where you had execs talking about handling that situation with colleagues that they have based there. And Singapore, I mean, I think the World Economic Forum's just been cancelled, hasn't it? Which was, I don't know, there's a lot of people have been watching that closely. I mean, the other poll I thought was extremely revealing that we conducted on day 2, because it's as much about the personal aspects of leadership that we discuss at these events, but approximately 48% said that they've rethought their career path as a senior leader over the past 15 or so months. I mean, that's high, isn't it?
I think it's high. I think that we've all gone through a sort of life-changing or life-reaffirming period. I think we see in Criticaleye there is I think there will be a huge number of executives who look to go plural over the course of the next 12 months. I think as you go back into the degree of movement and the pressure is increasing on the role, work-life balance comes into it. How do you get that balance right? I think people have had more time with their family and have quite liked it, and executives who were traveling extensively, not having to travel. What I would say is that I think that if you looked over a 3 to 4 year period, how many of them actually do take a different path, it will be lower than you
Yeah.
think. You'll also have a number of people who'll go plural and then come back into executive roles because they find it not as rewarding. So I think you've got to say that is the trend. And I think, we had our HRD retreat 2 weeks before that, and it was much higher, which I
It
think
was
again
higher. Yeah.
is really. And I think if you went through the organization at the different layers, you would see similar elements, and I think that you can't ignore it. It's huge, and I think that that's a global scenario. So that represents this flux of change. My general view is that we're at the first stage of looking at that change, and I think there's much more to come. And I think this resetting and recalibration, I think, is much harder than people envisage. And we're coming towards some of those problems rather than necessarily going away from them.
Yeah, I love the honesty of that response, because I think it shows you, because it's the job of leadership, isn't it, to be optimistic, to show a path forward, to be leading. But under that poll shows the inner turmoil that lots are experiencing.
I think that's been one of the things you'd say is a positive outcome of COVID. I think it's made people more human and leadership more human, and it's put the individual back into the center of things. And so I think that opens. I think last year's poll was from the CEO retreat, which is about the isolation element and how many felt isolated, was probably the most revealing statistic that we've had, in the sense that I don't think in my time in Criticaleye I've ever seen that degree of openness around isolation. It's a very rare thing for CEOs to feel that enough to be able to articulate. We all have elements as CEOs where you feel that, but to have that degree of it. So I don't think it's too surprising. You've got to remember that CEOs are probably at the older end of the spectrum. So that statistic about change of careers, in some ways they're on that path anyway, so it might accelerate. But you've also got to remember that one of the things that also came out from the CEO retreat was tenured teams, and the strength of consistency and trust with teams that have been consistent.
So that leads into the discussion in our opening panel, where we talked about consensus in the top team, and how that's come under pressure. And the areas that were highlighted there were hybrid working, pace of decision making, and ultimately future strategic direction. Would you agree that they're sort of the key areas where alignment and consensus in the top team are being tested?
Yeah, I think that there's much more of a challenge around those things today than there was for any time over the last 12 to 18 months. So for obvious reasons, it's complex, and they slightly link together. The element of pace and hybrid, to a certain extent, the links together. So there is difference of opinion around things, and I think again, where we've had a very aligned environment, that sort of mix of views is quite hard to ensure, to provide the airtime where everyone feels they've been a part of the decisions that then come from it. I think is something we haven't been doing for the last 12 months.
Yeah. What I thought was interesting is I think that there's a difference of opinion potentially related to personal agendas, because some people have found it much easier. I mean, there was a great example of a HRD that I interviewed who just does not want to go back into the office, which I found surprising, because you would think that there'd be more of an appreciation of the need for face-to-face contact. But yeah, in terms of alignment and personal agendas, do you think this is the crunch point, really, where leadership teams are really going to find out the reality of how aligned they are?
I think you're coming towards that. You've got to remember that we're still going through a lot of the COVID elements, and that will continue for some time. And so I think the some of the bigger decisions about alignment possibly are still a little bit way off. What I would say is that the fractions are probably getting larger. As people do move around, it creates more challenge. And I think that people have been able to operate at a very high level through a virtual world, because the volumes of things that you can do is huge. As you start moving around and traveling and seeing customers and moving around, that does come off. I think the other thing that is larger than people realize, I think people have found in leadership very little separation between their home and work lives over the last 12 months, and that issue is becoming more obvious, and I don't think that's healthy. And so I think that this interesting thing around this work-life balance question, I think, is a complex one, and again, I think one where there's a real variance of opinion, and ultimately CEOs and boards are going to have to reset the tempo that they want, and they're going to have to align everyone into that.
I love that example from the HRD retreat, where the exec you interviewed said that he sent a message to his family that he was working at home by having a tie on. If he took the tie off, then it was, yeah.
Well, I think that separation, I mean, as you know, I'm back in the office probably two to 3 days a week, and I think there's no question that the brain's moving faster again. And when you look back, that's sat stationary for week on, week out, that's not good for the soul. So again, I think what you're also seeing is, as a degree of that moving come back, I think some of the refreshness comes back, and I think that energy starts shifting. And I think that mix of where everyone is really exciting.
Quite question for you. What do you think hybrid really means?
I think
because it was used in the context of, okay, office, home, but I think it's more complicated than that, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is too much of hybrid, which is seen as just office and home. I think it is about where does your energy come from, and how do you create it, and where does your culture come from, and how do you reinforce it? And so I don't think it's about necessarily just an office. It could be an innovation center. Our retreats are massive energy for both our customers and members of Criticaleye, but also for the team of Criticaleye. That coming together, a sense of achievement. So sitting in front of a customer one-on-one. So for me, actually, the office is a small piece of that. What I do think is that each of those things have got to coalesce together, and understanding how they coalesce, and for your people to understand how to get the best out of themselves within it. Again, we're coming towards that, and I think that we just got to remember, any change creates positive, negative outcome, and that's what I think you're coming towards now. There is a point of change. We're not going to go back to the old model. We're not going to just be purely virtual. This new hybrid will be a different model, and that means you're going to have different winners and losers.
Yeah. I thought one of the themes to come out of it is that almost by necessity, a lot of companies have been more inward looking during this period, and you've seen some great things emerge from that, like greater openness around mental health and a real thinking about the diversity and mix of your employees, and what it means to be a leader. So that's been, I would say, positive. But now there is a shift to being more outward looking and really, I guess, thinking about the customer, how you're engaging and connecting. Do you think that this is now a sort of a shift in mindset that we're looking at in leadership teams? We're coming to that point.
I think we're coming towards that. Again, it depends on the wider position of if we go backwards and things. And if you're in India, you've got complexity. But no, I think that the real opportunity, and if you take that core word from the CEO, there is massive opportunity in combining the strength of a virtual with the cultural strength of in person, and that's really what the core thing is, to get that balance right. And that's true whether you're talking the board itself in terms of when and how does it come together, the exco, how does it work, and then how does that cascade down into the organization and into multi jurisdictions, because there isn't going to be a solution that fits and covers the whole global scenarios, and you're going to have people in different places doing it. So you've got a lot of moving parts there that you've got to work through.
Yeah. I mean, it feeds into this idea of agility, doesn't it? Which is much discussed. What's your take on what it means to be agile as a leadership team?
I think that you've got to be open and receptive to change, and that means that you've got to be prepared to fail. And you've really got to have a curiosity and an engagement in the wider market. I think you can't be a follower. You've got to move fast, but also go backwards just as fast. And that agility is being bold, but also being able to call it out when you've gone in the wrong direction, and getting the people in your cultural team who can move at that pace, but in a supportive way. I think that one of the challenges, I think, when you talk about agility is often it can be quite brutal. And the reality is, I think that one of the things we've seen for the last 12 months, strong cultures have outperformed weaker cultures. And so again, I think, how do you get agility with a really strong culture? And if you can get that two right, I think you're in an incredibly exciting point.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen huge interest in Criticaleye because I think it supports that external focus. Do you think it's that these are the themes that's driving that greater interest in the need to be sort of getting that alternative perspective, that different point of view, because there's an understanding that the sort of the culture of a leadership team may need to change if it's going to thrive going forward?
I think that one of the Criticaleye's core strength is that we're a very, very diverse environment where you've got all sectors, regional representation. And I think that what you do need in a faster changing environment where there's so much uncertainty, you need reference points that aren't in your narrow environment, because that's where change is happening. And that speed of understanding about how different sectors are evolving is so important. Partnerships that now are, you wouldn't have been feasible 3 years ago and now front and center, but those partnerships are not from within your own sector, they're from how do you leverage across sectors. And so if you look at really the accelerant for Criticaleye, it's breaking down the boundaries. What you can say is that removing physical boundaries is a massive accelerant for the transfer of knowledge through Criticaleye, which is, I think, true in any environment where if you can get that culture right, where you can break those barriers down and access diverse thinking in real time, I think that's incredibly needed and incredibly powerful.
Yeah, it was interesting. I conducted an interview on day one with CEO from the insurance sector, and he'd basically gone in, turnaround situation, rebuilt the leadership team. But one of the key things he needed in that leadership team was people from outside the insurance sector. And I think that's, you're hearing that more and more, aren't you?
Well, you've got, again, you need diverse inputs,
Yeah.
and that diversity of thinking, it creates a faster, more dynamic environment and the potential to lead. And I think that one of the things that is clear at the moment is you've got to have a leadership stance. What are you world class at? Simplifying the business and making sure it's really clear what your strengths are, and then executing against that. But having the ability to pivot and change, and having that breadth of leadership skills, just essential.
Do you feel for the first time CEO in this environment?
I think it's been a hard time to step into the role. You can argue a good time, because in some ways, normal sort of, you haven't got some of the pressure points and extended sort of traveling that you might have had to do. So you've had some time to be more visible. So in some ways, new CEO can be more visible in their organization through this phase. But you're learning your trade. I mean, effectively, through the years of Criticaleye, all CEOs would say that there's a learning process, and that learning process at a point of massive change and influx is quite hard. And I'll quote a CEO who I spoke to last week, who's gone into an organization as their first CEO role, and it's the company's virtual. She's not met any of the executive team, and she comes from outside the sector. She's been brought in as a change agent, and really hard for her to know where she is in relation to the team and the business, and she's on a learning point in the sector. That makes you quite isolated. And I think that the thing at the moment is that isolation on first time CEOs is quite strong. That need for external reference points is greater today than it's ever been.
Yeah. What I thought was interesting in that interview that I did is huge amount of change has been put through in the past two years, and balancing that pace of change could be a podcast in itself. But talking about alignment at the end, that's the area where, like, doing all of that virtually, there are certain things that you just won't get in terms of alignment in that leadership team. So that's going to be an area of focus where things are opening up and you can bring people back face to face, because I think it's having those harder edged conversations, isn't it, that you...
I think it is, and you've also got to remember we're probably coming back where normal metrics are beginning to be more visible. So, for example, we've got a very active AIM community in Criticaleye. Most AIM CEOs haven't been given full guidance out for quite a while. In fact, I had a AIM breakfast 2 weeks ago, and they're still not giving full guidance out. But that's not normal. Now, the reality is they quite enjoy that, because it's much easier to run a business where you're not having to give full guidance out. The reality is full guidance is coming back, and then it's hitting expectations. You've also got the complexity of costs. There have been costs that haven't been visible. Those costs are coming back. We talked a lot recently about inflationary pressure.
Yeah.
So there is traditional pressures. Those would be, I think, quite traditional pressures returning, and I think that's where you've got this interesting point in terms of first-time CEOs who, in some ways, haven't had those over the last 12 months, where actually they're going to come back quite quickly, and that's going to be hard to get the team back into that discipline at a point when there is so much complexity.
Yeah, and again, the poll that we conducted on is your board exerting more pressure on performance, it was just under four-fifths that said yes. So it's, I mean, again, it's indicative of it, of the sort of the shift in intensity, I guess, that's occurring.
I think that's right. I think that the natural elements of pressure are beginning to return. You've also got the complexity of governments coming back in terms of what their expectations are going to be, and obviously there's this balancing act between stimulating the economy and taxing the economy, and that's also a challenge on individuals, because a lot of talk about capital gains tax and what the implications are. So you've got some quite interesting moving parts. I mean, the irony is you've got high valuations for businesses right now, and in some ways that's positive because it shows you the positive optimism, but there's also pressure because ultimately those valuations then have high expectations. So I think this is going to be a really interesting period for CEOs. I think for first-time CEOs, you really got to be on your game.
Yeah. Just we've spoken about this, and I think it's worth covering, because we talk a lot about agility, change, transformation. However, when you look at some of the successful businesses out there, and if you look at the FTSE 100 and the leadership teams, there's a real consistency, isn't there? And I just sort of wondered if you wanted to share some thoughts on that, because it almost goes against some of what we're told. But there is, I mean, the CEO's been in place a long time. There's a succession plan, if you like, within the organisation, and there's a real strong culture that's in place. So, yeah, talk us through that.
Well, I think that again, leadership. There's cases for both sides in terms of organisations that need rapid change and evolution, and probably need to continually evolve leadership-wise, and then organisations that consistency is key to success. I mean, I think generally organisations that have longevity have a stronger culture and generally have strong internal succession capability. And personally, I feel every organisation should aspire to that. And so now within that, though, capital moves faster than people, and so if you look at the capital deployment, you look at the SPACs where new businesses can form to change the model of the market incredibly fast. You've got both these things that come true. What I do think is trust builds over time, and in reality and leadership, I do think that a team where you've only worked together a short period of time could be great on a project. But ultimately, I think that teams that have a degree of secure relationship, I think generally do outperform. What I do think, though, is those that can combine that with welcoming diversity into it and change into it, those are the real organizations that thrive. A culture where it's 80-20 development and out external, but those external people thrive and can become the CEO. I think that's really exciting.
Yeah.
Often the challenge on a more consistent basis is there's organ rejection for anyone who comes in from the outside, because your internal stakeholders are more important than the external stakeholders. So I think that the balance is right. I think an organization that has short tenured executives generally creates quite a short tenured culture within it, which again in a model where it's changing so rapidly might be right, but for most organizations a degree of consistency is important.
Yeah. Purpose is being discussed a lot at the moment, and you can argue it's an overused word, and I think it can make some people almost cynical. However, it does feel like a lot of companies are getting it, and they're tying it into, say, the way some companies are tying compensation into ESG goals. I think is really encouraging, and it feels like there's an understanding that your incentives are really going to be the key to changing behaviors. But do you feel like there's an elevation, if you like, in how seriously companies are looking at purpose and how it's informing performance decisions?
I think that yes, I think that is there is more belief behind that than there has been, I think, for a period. I think again it comes back to the period that we've gone through. It's been life changing, where everyone's looked at themselves and they've looked at why they exist, and that goes into your people. So I think that clarity and message and energy and that alignment becomes more important. So what I do think is that it's how do you maintain that through the metrics of the organization as you get contradictory elements that come out, and then as I've said, a more contradictory environment will challenge that more. So I think it would come into an interesting point around how does the board and the executive team really retain that purpose and ensure that it drives through the organization as the pressure points increase.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, based on the retreat, were there any observations that anything that came out that you'd like to flag and discuss?
I think that the overarching position, I do think it was great to finish with CEO talking about having fun, and I think that's the first time I've heard that said for a while, and I think that's really important. By the way, I think that in some ways it's felt wrong over the last 12 to 15 months to have fun. And I think you're beginning to see that personally. It's great to see things where people can go and have fun at all levels. But I think in boards and executive teams, that sense of humour, that fun is really important. I remember interviewing a female chairman not too long ago and discussing what was the most important thing for her in the role, and she said enjoying it and having fun. And that is the most important piece. Now, doesn't mean to say it's not tough and hard, but that element of enjoyment, there's no question teams where that is there will outperform those where it's not. And I think that it's great to see leaders beginning to be prepared to talk about enjoyment.
Yeah, energy as well, isn't it? That's what you need to
it's linked
through the organization. Yeah,
I think it's linked, and I think that the energy point is the most important thing. So we talk about pace, but pace is the outcome of the energy you've got in the business, and I think that's where CEOs and that energy and getting it and harnessing it and the excitement and the alignment, it's a great, in that sense, this is a great time for leadership. It's definitely a point when I think you can become a bit more front-footed, whereas in some ways I think it's been a period of quite defensive leadership.
Yeah. Okay. Matthew Blagg, thank you very much.
Thanks,
I will
Mark.
wrap this up there. Thank you, everyone.
Take care.
Enjoyed that. Take care. Bye.